Hi, my name is Nora Gelprin. I'm the Director of Sexuality Education and Training at Advocates for Youth. Thanks for joining me as we review Managing Personal Boundaries and Self-Disclosure. This information is adapted from work by Dr. Elizabeth Schroeder. And as we consider what a boundary is, a couple of things might come up for us. We could be thinking about the parameters in which we do our professional work with our students, with clients, with our learners. We could also be thinking about literally a barrier that keeps something from happening or something in place, like on a highway or a door. There's a number of different kinds of boundaries. There's environmental, physical, service boundaries, process boundaries, and personal boundaries. And that's the kind we're going to be focusing on today. When we think about boundaries and self disclosure, there's generally two different kinds of disclosure that we'll be discussing. One is passive disclosure, and the other is active. Let's look at an example of each. Passive disclosure would include something like you're teaching and a student notices that you're wearing a necklace with a Star of David on it. As a result, they ask you, "Are you Jewish?" That's a situation in which you haven't done anything but expressed who you are by your dress, your mannerisms, or your jewelry. It's a good example of passive disclosure. Active disclosure, on the other hand, is imagine you're teaching and the subject of families come up. One student who has heard you talk about your kids and your spouse before says, "You have kids, so did you wait to have sex until you were married?" So that's providing an opportunity for active disclosure. How are you going to respond to that question about your personal life, your personal decisions in the moment? That's an example of active disclosure, what you choose to do in that moment. Now, we know there are positive and negative outcomes to all of these kinds of decisions. When we choose to disclose personal information about ourselves in a learning environment, we know sometimes it can increase student participation. It can have more students feel comfortable sharing themselves. It can make them more comfortable with us. It can also decrease that power differential that sometimes we feel, where it can feel really removed between us as the educator and our learners. Sometimes it can help us develop rapport as well. So, those would all be positive outcomes of if and when we should choose to disclose personal information. On the flip side, there's also can be some negative outcomes of self disclosure as well. Sometimes it can really interfere with student learning. It may enhance the power of the educator's beliefs among the students. All of a sudden, what you believe and what your experience is the most important thing in the room, and it's what everybody should follow, when really we know that's not the case. It also shifts the focus onto you as the teacher and doesn't keep it on your students, which is really what we want to make sure we're doing in our classrooms. It can bring up questions about your own professionalism, and it can create role confusion. If you're there talking about your personal life and your personal decisions, is that then what's expected of all of your learners as well? Then the issue of social media comes up, and how do we manage that when it comes to disclosure? Some things to really think about when it comes to disclosing information via social media, whether that's on Twitter or Facebook or texting with our students. We know that when it's done electronically, it can be re-forwarded, reposted, and retweeted, sometimes in ways that are taken way out of context. Those things can be hard to undo once they're already done. We also know it can't be retracted once it's out in the public sphere, so to be really thoughtful and careful about sharing personal information electronically. We know there's some instances when it's totally fine to disclose personal information, particularly when you have a lot of trust with that particular group of learners or that individual. We know that it can be helpful when it enhances the learning environment, when you're using it to make a good educational point. We also know it's important not to disclose when you're just trying to do it to make others feel good, or to make them laugh, or to try to get them to like you. We also know to never disclose when it's about your personal sex life or your personal decisions that relate to you and your decisions about your sex life. It's also never okay to disclose when it's something you wouldn't want others to share about themselves as well. And lastly, to think about when it could jeopardize the future education or safety of that group. So, just some things to keep in mind as you weigh the decisions about whether and when to disclose personal information about yourself with your learners. Lastly, just some things to keep in mind. What's the difference between my intention versus the outcome of what my actions are? Is it possible that I could connect with my learners without sharing this information? Is there a way that in my actions and in my tone of voice that I could make that connection without necessarily having to share personal information? Make sure as well to review what your school district or your agency policy is. And if you don't have a policy, to make sure that you go and ask for one. Ask for some clarification from your supervisor. Lastly, to keep in mind that once you've disclosed something, you can never take it back, and you have no control over what another person will do with that information. And what you share about yourself generally is given more weight than what your learners or your students would share about themselves. So I hope that's some helpful review and some things to keep in mind as you consider when and with whom to share personal information when teaching sex education.